Stoa is a digital campfire where we cohere in dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of what's happening now.
Everyone, welcome to the Stoa. I'm Peter Lindbergh, the steward of the Stoa, and the Stoa is a place for us to cohere in dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of this very moment. And today we have a fun session. It's going to be an intimate session because I see there's a few of us in the room today. So we might just say, like, forget the normal protocols. We might have an organic conversation, turn off the record button. We'll see. But we have Mark Ledwich and Sam Clark, who spearhead a project called the Transparency Tube. And I'll share that in the chat right now. And this is a really, I don't know if anyone checked this out, but this is a really good way to get a visual sense of a lot of the mimetic happenings in the collective mind, or what I like to call the noosphere. And as people know who come to the Stoa frequently, I geek out about this type of stuff. So I'm quite happy to have Mark and Sam here to talk about their project. So how today's going to work, I'm going to tag in them in a minute. They'll have a 20-minute presentation. Then we'll pivot to Q&A, drop your question in the chat, calling you to mute yourself if you don't want to be on YouTube, and potentially Transparency Tube one day, then indicate that in the chat and I'll read your question on your behalf. And then we might just stop the recording and just have an organic discussion halfway through or something like that. So that being said, Mark, Sam, welcome to the Stoa, and the Stoa is yours. Oh, and I have to share my screen with some, or I'll give sharing access, so just let me know who.
I think Mark's going to do the presentation. But yeah, thanks for having us. We're excited.
Cool. So I'll just start with the background, like what we're doing with this project, what we aim to achieve with it. YouTube is a really important new way people consume news and cultural commentary. According to Pew, 26% of Americans say that they use YouTube for news regularly. And that's up from about 18% in 2017. So that's going quite quickly. It's still less than TV. So about 50% of Americans say they watch news on TV as of a few years ago. So that's decreasing. So the gap is closing quite quickly. So I think there's been not too much knowledge about what's going on, and its influence is growing quite quickly. The other way they're influential, it's a bit different to TV, is they recommend content that people watch. And the algorithm is personalized and constantly changes. But it affects, from the best estimate, which uses Nielsen data, which tracks people's actual web usage. We estimate around 40% of views come from those recommendations, and 50% if you include like the homepage as well. So they're influential in a different way to TV, which is less about choosing a particular channel to watch. It's also about the way the platform encourages content. They're not very transparent about what they do. So when they talk about their recommendations or moderation, it's more of a PR exercise. So they release very little, and it's always, if they do release data, it's just high-level data that's being tortured for PR purposes. And in terms of people like us who are looking to get data, they provide an API, but the terms of service just stop us from using it. So there's a few restrictions. We can't keep data for longer than 30 days, which means we couldn't actually show you the site that we're showing you. And we also aren't allowed to aggregate data across channels. So we wouldn't be able to do the visualization and comply with the terms of service anyway. There is some accountability, and it's not through government regulation. It's mainly through elite media. They're very responsive to criticism they get there. They're responsive to the advertisers. There's been a few times where advertisers have boycotted and they've responded, and their own employees. So they're also influenced by what their employees want, because it's quite competitive, the talent in tech, and they're just, yeah, they're very influenced by employees as well. In terms of media and in research, it's been understudied compared to other platforms, and the research does tend to have quite a left-wing bias, and so does the reporting on it. So we hope to come in to be more of a non-partisan, less biased view of the what's actually happening on YouTube, and try to improve the accuracy of the criticism against YouTube, so that their response to it provides for a better platform for everyone. And if there does happen to be regulation, that the public's more informed to influence how that actually gets done. So to actually start with this, we have to find the channels on YouTube that are political, and then to get some sort of quantitative analysis of it, we have to classify the channels in it. So this is start it again. This is me classifying the stoa as obviously right wing and conspiracy QAnon. It's good to see all the fellow QAnons here in the channel. And that's the main things we do when we're classifying channels, whether they're left, center, or right, and which tags they have. And to come up with this, this was work that myself and Anna Zaitsev from Berkeley did, and we discovered and classified about 800 channels to evaluate the influence that YouTube recommendations had. And to quantify this, we wanted to classify it in a way that connects to the current discourse about politics. So we're very influenced by Peter's mimetic tribes classifications, but we had slightly different priorities. So we wanted something that was natural for YouTube content, which has a different flavor to news and other media. We also, the other aspect is we wanted to be able to judge the category based on the content itself. So for example, we can use IDW as a category because apart from being anti-SJW, we didn't want to rely on a list of people that like Barry Weiss like listening to. It also needs to be topical to the current mainstream discourse about YouTube. So we couldn't talk about integral theorists or post-rationalists because people wouldn't really understand it. And we didn't want to have too much overlap. So we wouldn't want a category like InfoWars and QAnon that had a lot of overlap. In terms of left and right, so I was just describing what we call tags, so channels get multiple more specific categories. We also did left, right, and center. To do that, we calibrated ourselves with isidewith.com, which was useful in terms of listing the current salient political topics and surveys of left and right support for those issues. But also we just used our judgment, and we didn't take a philosophical approach to left and right, we took a social approach. So it's more about what people are currently talking about in terms of salient topics for those tribes, not so much what would be traditionally considered philosophically left or right. So an example of that is channels promoting free speech, for example, we consider to be a right-wing issue, which has been a bit controversial with some, but I think that was the right approach. So in terms of a retrospective on how we did, we had 3 reviewers go through those 800 channels that we found, and then we evaluated how consistent we were with each other. So the purple column there is a score between -1 and +1, one where we have perfect agreement, and 0 where it's completely random whether we got the same score or not. So you can see some of the ones at the bottom, revolutionary, anti-whiteness, or provocateur, we did pretty badly. So we basically didn't use any of those tags that we came up with originally in our final analysis. So we didn't continue those on. And I think that's a fairly good process to go with when inventing new categories, is to make sure you're consistent. Between me and Anna, we spent a few weeks almost full time watching YouTube, and almost died, I would say. But I think it's a valuable experience to build on the ground knowledge of YouTube content by just consuming the whole gamut of it. And then we can use that as intuition and knowledge to inform our analysis and intuitions about YouTube going forward. So it wasn't a healthy exercise, but I think it was needed. I don't think I would trust very much research from people that haven't actually looked at the content of channels, which does happen. So we got kind of a review by fire that when we released Transparency Tube. So there was a lot of fairly upset anti-woke channels because they didn't like being classified as right. So if a channel just had purely anti-woke content, because we considered that a right-wing topic, if there wasn't enough to balance it out, they were considered right. And they were afraid that lists like these, where they were listed as right-wing, would disadvantage them, or there'd be a target for moderation, or just being disadvantaged with the algorithm because we did that. But they were also like really fascinated about what tags they got and what the other channels they knew got. It was also brought a lot of attention. So we got a lot of actionable feedback and emails with channels that we missed or channels that we misclassified. That feedback, we took all of that, and a fair amount, we actually updated reviews or added the channels they suggested or removed them if they didn't belong. So it's hard to quantify, but I feel like by being responsive to criticism and engaging with them, we did improve our data set for that process. So last year, Sam reached out to me because I shared the original data set of that 800 channels. He'd used that and created a model, which he's about to talk about. But through that, I realized he showed me that part of the problem was we were missing a lot of the channels. So there's actually at least something like 7,000 channels that meet our criteria. So we thought we had a fairly exhaustive list at 700 because we're getting diminishing returns using lists and discovering channels through recommendations. But we were missing a lot, and it wasn't particularly even either. So I'm showing here the mainstream media YouTube channels where we had most of the ones that you see pictures for. And then this is the independent YouTube channels where we're missing a large amount of the channels that you don't see pictures for. So we're missing the sand and some of the pebbles. And like I broke out the zoom, so you can see just how many tiny channels there are in the independent ecosystem. This didn't affect our top level results too much, so it wasn't that bad, but I was very surprised, and it was great to have Sam take our data and run with it.
All right, I can take it from here for a slide. So just to give you a little background, my background's in machine learning and natural language processing. I am in the middle of a self-funded sabbatical on close to the end of year one. It was only supposed to be a 1-year sabbatical, but I've been having too much fun working on this YouTube project, so it keeps getting extended. But yeah, I have been fascinated about the lack of transparency into YouTube and lack of understanding of the tail of content. as Mark called out. And so I came across his data set and used it to develop some methods to discover and classify channels automatically. Given the scale of YouTube, there is really no way of getting around machine learning, using machine learning and AI to study anything more than the smallest of communities on the platform. And so I developed this method and wrote up the method with Anna Zaitsev, who worked with Mark as well. And a preprint of that paper is available. It is a little technical, and this might not be the right audience to get into the details, but I'll go over some of the high-level contributions and why I think it's interesting. So as Mark already called out, he discovered, or he labeled 800 channels, but that was really only the head, and the tail. Even though he was seeing these diminishing returns, it's just so long and large that it accounted for another 6,500 channels. So originally it was 7,300 channels, but we have gone through and done some more extensive labeling, and some of those were mislabeled. There were some philosophy channels that were kind of borderline whether they should be considered political and cultural, and then just it's an automatic method, so there were some channels that were just misclassified that we ended up removing. So now it's down to 6,500 additional channels, and these all have over 10,000 subscribers. If we lowered that threshold, it'd be hundreds of thousands of channels. So what this method relies on that's really interesting is the public subscription pages for commenters. So an example of the public subscription page for a random commenter's in the bottom left image. And I think someone who's familiar with some of these channels could get a pretty good sense of what interest this person has just by looking through these channels. It's a pretty small image, but people like squint and look closely at it, they can see, the New York Times and Vice, and so I think to the average person that would make it seem it would be natural to see, say, Last Week Tonight in there as well, and so we took advantage of this both to discover channels and to classify channels. And what made this possible is that 30% of commenters have these public subscription pages, and they subscribe to 200 channels on average. And so it made it possible for us to quickly discover a massive number of channels. And then the machine learning component was necessary because you discover such a large number of channels, there's no way you could go through and manually review them. And so to classify them automatically, we used this shallow neural network that created embeddings for each channel in this high dimensional space. And if two channels were in a similar location in this high dimensional space, if their embeddings were a similar location, they were likely to be similar channels. Then we applied an algorithm on top of that. It turns out this performed much better than kind of the more natural approach that would be used to classify a channel, which is to look at the transcripts and the video titles and so on. And we ran experiments to show this performed much better than state-of-the-art approaches that use that method. And then we, on top of using this method to discover political channels, we also used it to classify the soft tags that Mark has gone over. And it turned out it did quite well for that too. In fact, given, there's some subjectivity to some of the soft tags, pretty much all of them, partisan right means something different to two people. Inter-annotator agreement was still quite high for that. But this model performed better than the average individual annotator, which was pretty impressive. Because we used this iterative systematic approach, it also gave us the ability to actually measure the recall of the total number of channels that met the criteria we were interested in. And that's something, no other studies of communities on YouTube had done. So we're pretty excited to try to determine just how comprehensive our set of channels is. And 0.78, we can definitely that's the recall we ended up estimating. We can still improve on that, but you know, we have orders of magnitude more channels than other researchers who've studied political YouTube. So we feel like, you know, we're still adding a lot more transparency and clarity into what's going on in the community than was possible before. And lastly, this bottom right graph really shows the value of supporting this tail. So, you know, Mark, he was right that having labeled the head channels still got him most of the way there when it came to covering channels that most people were watching. So this bottom right hand graph shows the difference in viewership between channels, the 250 or so channels that have 500,000 or more subscribers, and then the 7,000 plus channels that have less than 500,000 subscribers. And those head channels do cover 60% of views, but they actually have a much different makeup than the tail channel. They really underrepresent partisan right and conspiracy channels, which I think is a fascinating aspect of YouTube. You have this sea of these small conspiracy channels that you'll miss if you just focus on the most popular channels. And so yeah, it's, you know, another reason we were excited that we were able to develop this method to really get a view into what's going on political YouTube. So I'll toss it back to Mark.
Awesome. Thanks, Sam. Yeah, so this is the site. You should go there yourself. I'll just go through some of the top level findings that are interesting. Mainstream news is the largest group. So there was a lot of claims from independent media that they were dominating through YouTube, or like independent media had overtaken mainstream news in general, but even just on YouTube, mainstream's still bigger, and it's been growing quite quickly. So I think there's been a movement of people, a movement of mainstream onto YouTube. Partisan left with only slightly more views than partisan right, and just left and right, it's fairly even as well. Trump did really well coming into this election in particular, with more than like 6 times the views of Biden's channels, and like at the time leading up to the election, it was equivalent to any of the big channels. There's very few white identitarian and manosphere channels, but more conspiracy and religious conservative channels than I would have expected. So that's just a bit of my background on that, but I'm pretty sure most people would be surprised. And socialism smaller than I expected as well. So that's the breakdown of views. We also look at remove videos. So because we refresh videos every day, we can check whether a view's missing one day when it was there the day before. So with that, we can capture which videos YouTube has removed and the reason they gave. Interesting things from here is they did do a large QAnon crackdown in September, and the type of channels removed is more than 3,000 right-wing removals compared to left-wing. So there's quite an imbalance with what they removed, and they've got a lot more strict with their moderation, down to removing particular narratives around election fraud or coronavirus. We also looked at the election fraud narrative, which gives a summary, an easy way to see who's talking about election fraud and whether they're supporting it or not, and allows for an easy way to drill down into exactly what people are saying, into the individual transcript at the time that they're talking about it. So I'll let you investigate that. I'm already well over the time, so I'll open up to questions.
Cool. I'm gonna stop sharing your screen. Yeah, that's awesome. Got a bunch of questions. might push back on your STOA categorization offline, but how do you hope people will use this platform, and maybe what do you hope for it in the future, especially in this kind of like the time we're living in?
Yeah, I hope that like a reporter at Vice or Vox or New York Times, before they write an article talking about the dominance of right-wing YouTube, that they just check here first. So I hope that it's seen as kind of like Pew researchers for polls on things. I hope that we have that reputation as trustworthy, nonpartisan information that people go to check before they talk about it.
Yeah, just to
and
I was going to say to continue with the transparency theme. Mark is center right and I'm center left, so we do love the idea of this being nonpartisan and just bringing more data to the conversation. We realize that a lot of people understand the power YouTube has, but there's very little data. There's a lot more anecdotal evidence being brought to discussions, and we hope to provide that data to journalists, as Mark was saying, as well as academic researchers do, and just curious citizens who just want to have a better sense of, similar to what like All Sides or some of these other biased checker sites for news provide, where they can show you, how different groups are reporting on the same topic.
And we want to provide cold analysis, generally good information about things that YouTube should be accountable for in terms of their influence over political discourse, to improve everyone's conversations about it, as well as how YouTube's held accountable for what they're doing.
Another thing that's I'm quite curious with is taxonomy, because you both read my white paper, and then I just winged it essentially. I just relied on my intuition, or me and my co-author did. We did some research, but nothing really too rigorous or anything. And that's kind of like the trick, is getting it right. And you mentioned All Sides, and I talked to the guy who founded that on my podcast, and he had his method. But things get nebulous now. Even the terms left and right these days is like a shape-shifting kind of spectrum in terms. And you mentioned something about free speech, putting that on the right side and making that decision. So I'm curious if you can speak a little bit more about the nebulosity of these terms and then the spectrum itself, and maybe any other pushback you got from people, maybe outside of the anti-woke constellation.
Yeah, left and right. It is going through, in terms of the value systems and ideology that we talked about kind of in political science. It definitely is no longer matching that quite exactly. We're going through a transitionary period, I think. It is fairly easy though. Like if you basically treat it as an alien coming in and looking at the discourse, the way people talk about particular topics, and which from people that support a particular tribe, it is actually really easy to tell which topics what. It's actually not that hard, I think, as long as you forget what has come before. And I did think maybe we should call it blue team and left team, just to make sure we're not being confused with the more traditional look at the philosophy of left and right. Because yeah, we're not considering the philosophy at all. We're just looking at, as it stands now, who on what side will talk about issues in what way. In terms of feedback, other feedback we got some useful feedback, but none too negative outside the anti-SJWs. Maybe some of the white identitarian channels really didn't like being called that, but we were very careful. We didn't rely on the the automatic classification for white identitarians. We actually went through each one that identified and found evidence and videos for each of them if we believed that they were. So we were quite careful with that one, because we knew that's quite like has a lot of reputational damage if you're not. So we were careful about that. But yeah, some that found that they were classified as that definitely did not like it, which is understandable. But yeah.
And I'm curious what you have to say, Sam, about that. But my follow-up question is, because when I did the research and dive deep in all these weird corners of the internet, I didn't have data how big it was, obviously. But I found let's say the right constellation a lot more nuanced in their positions, like even the kind of the manosphere. It's like you have men right activists, manosphere, incels, MGTOW, they all hate each other. Where it seemed like on the left, there was a more kind of unity of thought in some kind of areas. And perhaps that might be why there might be anger of kind of a broad classification in that realm. So I'm curious if you agree with that assessment, and if you have any other thoughts on it.
No, I don't think so. Like I find the closer I get, the more fragmented it seems wherever you go, whether like you look at the left subcultures or the right-wing ones. I think the anger or the upsetness from anti-woke people who's being called right is because they're kind of legitimately, they identify as left, that have been like made homeless because social justice is just so bad that they've been forced to criticize their own side. That's kind of the way most of them see it. So they don't think of themselves as right, but they're also kind of afraid of, if they are labeled right, the consequences for that. So they're afraid of being throttled in terms of recommendations, or the stigma attached to being right-wing among the circles that they're in. But I think this could be, like, I think this is the new divide. Like for young people, being anti-social justice might be the new right-wing stance, but they could grow up to be the new right, which is like pro-gay rights, but then against social justice. So it's kind of it was as if we're having an intervention where, like, maybe you are.
Yeah, Peter. I just to get back to your last question, Anna and Mark were the ones who spent a lot of time defining those initial categories, so I didn't have a lot of input there. Kind of have been working with the data that they made available, although we have since then added some smaller categories like QAnon that obviously have grown since their initial analysis. But it is still something I think about, and it's hard to know kind of where to draw the lines around some of these groups. But to get back to this recent question, I think, as Mark pointed out, there are some creators that might be in denial a bit about the sort of content they're creating. They might identify as liberal, but they have found this niche that they're seeing a lot of success in. It might be constantly discussing how feminism is ruining Star Wars, or some niche like that, which is consistently right-wing content. And we're not trying to label the creators themselves, we're labeling their content. And so we label their channel right-wing. So I think that was the dominant pushback we got. And I think it really kind of points to an interesting aspect of YouTube where there is this feedback loop where these creators, might seem like they have power because they have a large number of followers, but they still have a lot of competition and feel a lot of pressure from their followers or subscribers to create content that, meets that demand. And so there is a bit of a role reversal there. And I think that's something we've discussed with other researchers. So it'll be interesting to see how that's teased apart in the near future. Kevin Munger at Penn State's a researcher who's hopefully going to release a study soon on that specific topic.
Very cool. Yeah, because when I was heavy into this stuff, it was back in 2018, and a lot has changed. And I'm curious, like, if Transparency Tube hangs it's like around for a while, like, a guy like Dave Rubin started with Young Turks. Now he's like a full-blown Trumpist. So it'd be cool to see the, you know, the trajectory of his memetic evolution in his channel. Do you have any?
Totally.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, hopefully, we hope to have you know, we're in discussions with researchers at NYU and George Washington University and trying to find like the right sort of funding sources to keep this going. But I'd love for us to be able to continue to update our labels and track the evolution of these creators over time.
Yeah, it would even be interesting to see the evolution of like similar channels. So the common subscribe channels over time would probably reflect the ideological change. So even if, like, our labels aside, just the similar channels over time would probably show a Dave Rubin trajectory.
Yeah, totally. I'm sure the people who are still liberal and haven't gone on this journey with Dave Rubin have stopped subscribing to him. So, you know, ideally it'll be something we can use machine learning to track.
Chris, for a question.
Yeah, hey guys, thanks for all your work. So my question has to do with labels that you're interested in, but you don't really have that much data. I think you talked about like integral a bit earlier on. What are some other things within the YouTube sphere you guys are curious about?
I'm thinking about anti-establishment as a label. So someone like Jimmy Dore or Glenn Greenwald would be the type of people I'm thinking about, because they don't fit too well into being, they're fairly left, but they definitely don't like the democratic institution, but they're not socialist either. So they don't fit very well into our current categories. But I don't think there's enough of them yet to add the tag. That's just one off my head. But I'm interested to hear any suggestions.
Do you have any follow-up question, Chris? And if anyone has suggestions, just feel free to start throwing them in the chat.
Yeah, on my end, I'd say there aren't specific mimetic tribes I've been thinking about, but I've been thinking a little more generally around pseudoscience and some of the adjacent communities that have a significant amount of misinformation, especially during the pandemic. That kind of, you know, or like just like how you view the world in terms of what you consume. But you know, we haven't had a chance to like really dive into those health and wellness spaces that might be adjacent to political and culture, and see how pseudoscience is being spread in those. Hopefully we'll get to that at some point.
All right. Andreas, you had a question about the New York Times piece today. You can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Oh, that's me, I guess.
Yes.
I was just replying to someone else there, but yeah, I guess I can ask that. So the New York Times apparently released a piece today, I think, where they again referred to the okay hand symbol and Pepe as being widely recognized symbols of the alt-right, which to me is now ridiculous and pretty well debunked. But yeah, I guess if there's a question in there, it would be, what do you think about the general take and thinking about this whole space in the mainstream media?
And if I could just tag in Heather, because that was actually Heather's question, so I called the wrong person. Heather, would you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Actually, Andreas just did a really beautiful job, so that was great.
Awesome.
Do you want to take this, Sam? Or?
I mean, I don't have a ton of context here. I've watched Feel Good Man. I'm not sure if others have, about the cartoonist from San Francisco who created Pepe the Frog. I thought it was really beautiful documentary. Very sad how Pepe's been co-opted by so many groups, but he's really fighting to take it back. And yeah, I know it's a complicated issue, but I'm a complicated issue that I haven't read this New York Times piece. I could see it missing some of the nuance there. for sure. So.
Yeah, it definitely doesn't seem like I see it on fairly normie Twitter even now, like Pepe's and different memes and Wojaks and things like that. They've gone a lot more, they seem a bit more mainstream than they used to be. Yeah, I wouldn't, if someone posts that, I wouldn't assume that they were alt-right. And yeah, that does seem like if you write that today, that's a bit out there.
Leslie, you had a question?
I do. Thank you. I've read just in mainstream media, not in academic papers, about a huge problem of bots, where depending on the article I read, anywhere between 10 and 90% of subscribers on YouTube and Twitter and so on are just bots. There's no human behind them. They're just created by scripts. And it's either to inflate your subscriber count, because then you kind of like a law of gravity, you get a certain number of subscribers, it attracts subscribers in the recommendation engines, or B, it's click fraud, so that if you have advertising, you just have bots that watch the videos and you get more revenues that way. Is there anything in your research that is able to distinguish between actual humans, minds, eyeballs watching videos and participating, and bots?
Do you want to take that first, Mark, or do you want me to?
Oh, you go.
Just stab at it? Yeah, I think it's a great question. It, I believe, is a bigger issue on Twitter and other platforms that aren't monetizing traffic. I think it is hard to get fake views on YouTube from what I've read and trying to research this topic, because they are monetizing the platform and YouTube has an incentive to crack down very quickly on any attempt at doing that. But with subscribers, I think you're absolutely right that there are these networks of fake subscribers that are used to help channels get momentum, which is why we focus more on views than we do subscribers. But also there's a really interesting data source that we're hoping to get access to in the near future that will help us tie this data to like actual human beings. Because, you know, when you're looking at a group like QAnon, it's not clear whether, I think they got nearly 1 billion views in 2020. It's not clear whether that's, you know, like a small number of people watching thousands of videos, or, you know, a large number of people watching a few videos. And Nielsen has a web panel data set that they've created from having a plugin on hundreds of thousands of American computers who have, you know, voluntarily installed this plugin. And there's been recent research that has leveraged this to actually look at the percentage of Americans consuming news, including specific like groups of creators and how much traffic they're getting. So we'd like to use that as well to really dive into, you know, how many Americans are actually consuming QAnon on YouTube, or partisan right versus partisan left, so on.
Any follow-up, Leslie?
Oh, that's good. Thank you.
Laura, do you have a question? I know you were, yeah, there you go.
Yeah, I feel shy just because I don't know much about the way that YouTube works, but I think one thing I hear quite frequently is the power of YouTube to kind of radicalize people quite subtly. Like you click on one video and then you find another one, and it seems like it's just a step-by-step progression, but you actually get quite far. So I wonder if you guys have any ideas how to counteract that, like how, and maybe this is part of my second question, which is what is the ideal function of YouTube, but maybe particularly to address this problem of how to get kind of a more balanced view.
I think the best part about YouTube isn't the politics. Like the best part about YouTube, I think, is the how to cook or fix things. Like so that's great, and the recommendation algorithm for that is good too. We looked at, we studied the recommendation influence from YouTube. So we took our categories and looked at a selection of videos every day on these channels and recorded what the recommendations went to. And there wasn't the recommendation rabbit hole that Tristan Harris or Kevin Reese in the New York Times talk about. It was definitely had more of a mainstream influence on average for a non-logged in user. But there's definitely, I'm not saying that it doesn't happen in terms of someone looking for that. So you can radicalize yourself, I think, including YouTube. And it won't really matter what the recommendations were so much. You're just looking for that type of content. You might search for it, or you might find links, or you might be in a group on Discord or just on a group in Twitter and click on links that they're giving you. So definitely I'm sure a lot of radicalization involves watching YouTube, and maybe it's more like salient. Like I noticed that the type of content on a video is kind of more moralistic. And there might be something to do with gossip and a face talking to you that's different to text, that's more where condemnation or talking about values or being afraid of what the other side is doing is just a bit more salient than in other mediums. So there could be something there. And I don't really have any answers, but it's complex.
Yeah, Mark's spent a lot more time thinking about this than I have. You know, and I kind of push back when he calls out his research that on average, YouTube recommends center left or mainstream content more frequently than right-wing content, because I think it's hard to know how engaging each of the recommendations is. So, you know, YouTube, they're likely the only ones that have great data on whether this sort of radicalization is really occurring at scale. I think it's a really complicated topic, but we do both totally agree on it. They're probably being too much focused on the recommendation system versus some supply demand aspects that could really drive certain content being more popular. So with the election fraud narrative, even though YouTube was actively trying to avoid recommending videos that were pushing Trump's narrative of widespread election fraud, we still found that those videos received a massive amount of views. And so that could have been coming from Discord chat groups or Twitter or other sources, which I think is important to take into consideration.
Any follow-up, Laura?
I just hadn't, that's striking to hear, right, that it might actually be a demand problem more than an algorithm. I mean, yeah, maybe informed to some degree by algorithm, but yeah, it's a different problem. Thank you. Yeah.
And I'm curious if you have any takes on the current happenings right now with Parler going down and the president getting removed off Twitter. Any kind of insights that you gained or just perspectives that you have from the vantage point of all the data that you've been playing with?
Do you want to go first, Mark?
Yeah, I'll go first. We were talking a lot about this yesterday, and like we definitely coming from different. I'm definitely more. I want kind of in general less moderation. Having said that, in terms of Trump getting banned from a variety of tech platforms, I kind of see him as a special case. Like he crosses a line, I think, that I have where it does seem fairly direct incitement to violence, which is pretty clear. So whether that's a permanent ban or not, that I worry about. I worry about the permanence of it, but I kind of agree with it. Parler, on the other hand, I'm definitely against that. I feel almost threatened myself because I've been the target of, mainstream media ire, and the idea that they will at the same time ban me from platforms. Like I feel threatened by that myself, yet alone someone who's like properly right-wing. So I think there's a large problem with American politics that are just getting so tribalized, and there's so much negative polarization that things like this just add fuel to the fire, and they make a lot of things worse they're claiming to improve. So I think the more threatened people on the right feel about being censored or kicked off platforms, even with their business, So, you know, I rely on these tech platforms to do what I do, and I feel mildly, it's probably unlikely, but I still feel mildly threatened by it myself. So it just can't help. So I'm definitely against this coordinated, or it might not be coordinated, but kind of arbitrary activity that happens at the same time from Silicon Valley companies that are arbitrary and political. I just really don't like.
Yeah, yeah. As Art pointed out, I'm probably for moderation more often than he is, or deplatforming more often than he is. But I also am skeptical of deplatforming some groups like QAnon. We actually have some really interesting data on QAnon that we're hoping to go a lot deeper on. We were able to discover 350 channels with over 10,000 subscribers that are QAnon channels, and a large number of those were removed during the ban that Mark mentioned, and that data has just disappeared. But luckily, we scraped that data and saved that data. You know, one benefit of not following YouTube's terms of service is very convenient for them when content on their platform that makes them look bad just disappears. But we still need to study this and really understand what role YouTube played in the spread of that, or you know how that community used YouTube. I should give them more agency, as Mark has pointed out. Yeah, so what, you know, how they use YouTube, and it's still unclear what percentage of that community migrated to other platforms like BitChute and Rumble. And there has been research that has shown that when migrations like this occur from deplatforming, the community does become even more radical. So, you know, a solution I would love to see, and I'm sure there are all sorts of hurdles, would be to not remove QAnon from YouTube, but to force these PSAs, like mandatory 30-second ads before every single QAnon video you watch that helps de-radicalize members of that community. I think that there's reasons YouTube wouldn't want to do that because it adds friction in their system, and they're all about removing all friction. But it, I think, would have a better net impact of helping stop the spread of this community, and really, hopefully, you know, I feel like it's kind of, there's some mental health issues that have led people to some of these more extreme conspiracy groups, and could help solve this, hopefully, or, you know, yeah. So really, really hard to say on a case-by-case basis whether deplatforming was necessary. With Parler, I, you know, think given that an insurrection occurred and there's potential for more violence, I feel like that deplatforming by AWS may have been necessary, but I also don't have all the facts there.
All right, I'll sneak in one more question. So I've been working hard and code switching my ass off not to get this place categorized as any one mimetic tribe or anything. I don't know how well I'm doing from your guys' perspective. Mark seems very confident of where we should belong, but yeah, any advice for someone who does not want to get categorized?
I think yeah, you're doing pretty well. Like I was actually seriously trying to categorize your channel, and it was hard. So I think you're doing well, and keep it up.
Yeah, yeah. Mark's definitely has this depth of knowledge there. Given I haven't spent a full week of my life watching YouTube 8 hours a day.
I was tempted to give anti-SJW, but it's borderline. If you get anti-SJW, it's very light.
All right, I'll step up my social justice game and bring some more guests in. So any concluding thoughts for us today before we close out?
I mean, I just want to thank everybody for their time. I really appreciate you taking the time out to learn more about the project we've worked on. We love getting feedback. So if there are any features you think could be beneficial, any channels, of course, we should relabel. That'd be great. Also, always looking for people to collaborate with that are doing interesting research around politics on social media, obviously YouTube in particular. So yeah, would love to continue this conversation with anyone that's interested.
Yeah, likewise. And we share all our data. So the small sets of data, like the list of channels and their categories, we share for free. A full set of data that's updated daily, if you want access, we'll provide at cost. So yeah, definitely keen on helping anyone in the space get access to the information.
Yep.
Awesome, beautiful. I'll make some closing announcements, but Mark, Sam, thank you so much for coming to the STOA and doing what you do. Greatly appreciated. For tomorrow, we have Brent Cooper, Convergence for Consensus Building. That's at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. And then we have Renee Girard helps us understand our world next week at January 19th at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. He's one of the leading scholars, so that should be pretty fun. All events can be checked out at thestoa.ca. That being said, everyone, thanks for coming to the STOA today.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.